This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is Carolyn Dunster. Carolyn is a planting designer, botanical stylist, garden writer and author of a book all about eating plants. The book is A Floral Feast, a guide to growing and cooking with edible flowers, foliage, herbs and seeds. We discuss how to expand your culinary endeavours to encompass the ornamental parts of your garden.
Well, my background is initially as a writer on lifestyle magazines. I then moved into horticulture and I did professional floristry training program with Jane Packer. And then I did a garden design diploma at the Integral School of Garden Design. And this is actually my third book. So, I've just really loved flowers for as long as I can remember. Started arranging them using imported flowers and then had a wake-up call, probably earlier than most actually, because this is about 10, 15 years ago, where I felt like I didn't want to keep working with flowers that had been imported from halfway across the world. And I started growing my own flowers to use in my floristry work. And my first book was about how to grow flowers in a small city garden, because that's what I've got. And I touched on edible flowers in that book. I subsequently then went on to write a book about growing flowers for cutting and drying. And then after that book came out, I was like, okay, so what am I going to write about now? And I just, the edible flower thing, I think I tried to get a book off the ground quite a few years ago and nobody was interested. And then suddenly, I think probably because people want to take photographs of their food all the time and they want it to look pretty, there's been a sort of edible flower kind of outburst. And there's a few books now on the subject. I know there's another one coming out in a couple of weeks' time. A couple came out last year. And I just think it's probably a thing, like the drying flowers was actually a few years ago. So it was the right time to do a book on edible flowers.
Yeah, I understand. I think it is. And I still think that despite the fact that probably if you're involved in that world, you feel like it's having a moment. But I think a lot of people still are a little bit fearful of eating flowers as it happens. In terms of using flowers in a culinary capacity, has it always been a thing? Does it date back a long time? And do you think that it is having a bit of a renaissance at the moment?
Well, it's definitely having a renaissance. I did a little bit of research when I was just sort of putting my book proposal together, and there's evidence to suggest that flowers were used in Chinese cookery a very long time ago. And we know that the Romans ate roses and lavender, and also a lot of the herb flowers. The apothecary gardens were specialised in growing herbs and herbal flowers, which were often used for medicinal reasons. But also I think people probably in those days didn't differentiate so much between what was a flower and what was a sort of edible vegetable or whatever. I think maybe now, because restaurants are starting to use them, and you can watch MasterChef or another cookery program and you'll see people using flowers to decorate their food. There's definitely, whether it's a renaissance or just an interest, that people now sort of want to see their food in a slightly different light. And also the whole plot to plate thing, I think that's definitely got something to do with it. Just like we want to eat strawberries when they're in season, I think it's quite nice to be able to go out and pick your nasturtiums and make a salad with them when they're in season in your garden. So I think there's lots of reasons why there's definitely more of an interest.
Yeah, and also I think it's so extravagant to purchase something that you're going to use as a garnish, because it would probably come wrapped in plastic.
Oh, can I just stop you there?
Yeah, of course.
Absolutely, categorically do not eat any flowers that you've bought from a flower shop or a supermarket as cut flowers. The whole point of my book is to show that you should really only eat flowers that you've grown yourself, so that you know exactly what kind of soil they've been grown in and that they haven't been sprayed with anything. I really wouldn't recommend eating flowers if you don't know the origin.
No, that's an excellent point. I was probably thinking more along the lines of herbs and, microgreens and that sort of thing if you were going to use those as a garnish. Sure. But yeah, absolutely. Very, very important point to make, I think. If you want to add something to your food in terms of, like a style or a signature or a colour theme, then flowers are the way to do it. And it is so seasonal and it is something that you can do. And like I said, it's giving your food like a really nice twist without buying something that, like I said, could come in packaging, could come flown from miles away, maybe probably out of season, maybe not organic. So yes, it's a fantastic way of adding value to your dishes and aesthetic value. Yeah. And so you mentioned nasturtiums, and I think, again, sometimes people have a little bit of trepidation around edible flowers, but what would you recommend is a really good starting point, maybe in terms of ease of growing, but also in terms of flavour? If you wanted to ease yourself in gently, I'm sure some have got more flavour than others.
Yeah, definitely. Scented flowers are always going to have more flavour. And I think the sort of trend is to use scented flowers in sweet dishes. And that's probably sort of the entry point in terms of making jams and jellies. So things like roses, lavender, lilac, which you may already have growing in your garden anyway, but you haven't sort of necessarily thought of harvesting them to eat. I mean, I think in terms of easy staples to grow, annuals especially, so you could be sowing your annual seeds right now. As I say, nasturtiums, calendula, cornflowers, French marigolds, the kind of obvious ones that you might grow. Some flowers, for example, the petals have a nutty taste, but then you can also leave the seeds to ripen once the petals have gone over, and they sort of tick 2 boxes. So yeah, I think there's lots that people probably already grow anyway, but don't realise that they can actually be eaten.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, when I started digging into it, and especially when I read your book, there were lots in there. I'm quite experimental with what I grow and what I put on my plate, but even I was surprised. And are there any more unusual edible flowers that people might not realise that you could eat?
Well, people are always surprised when I say you can eat dahlias, but they're actually delicious and they have a wide range of flavours. It's almost like you pick a bunch of different dahlia varieties and it's like choosing from a fruit bowl of tropical fruit. So I think they're always quite an interesting one. Salvias, okay, we know about the sage as a herb, but all ornamental salvias have flowers which taste just like black currants, which are delicious. And then there are other ones like busy lizzies, for example, lots of open summer flowers, which are really great for attracting pollinators, are also edible. I don't know whether that's just a coincidence, but the brightly coloured flowers like begonias, for example, which taste a little bit like cucumber. There's a whole range of flowers which I think, people don't realise that you can eat them. And some of them may not have huge flavour, but they always add something to a dish.
Yeah, that's really interesting about the colour having an effect on the taste. And I mean, as you said, some of them I think you could probably throw in a salad and you might not notice they were there other than how they look. But is there anything that you would go for, apart from the dahlias, which you've mentioned, that have got a particularly good flavour that really could enhance a dish?
Yeah, I've got a chrysanthemum broth in my book, which is literally just made using chrysanthemum flowers. That's actually adapted from a Southeast Asian recipe where they use a lot of chrysanthemums in their food.
That's fascinating as well. I mean, chrysanthemums, again, have got a really sort of distinctive smell when you crush the leaves.
And I love the smell. And then, I think the thing about eating flowers is that the taste and the smell work hand in hand.
Well, I guess also the look of it as well. It's just such a complete package. And talking about the recipes that you've got in your book, you've got an amazing one for floral jam, which I really fancy having a go at. But I wondered if you could maybe describe that, because that really kind of floated my boat.
Yes, I think if you make jam anyway, it's probably not such a huge departure. But if you're a novice jam maker and you just fancy finding a way to preserve your edible flowers, then jams and jellies are an obvious way to go. So you basically only need a few ingredients, which is caster sugar, lemon juice, and then a few handfuls of whichever flowers you want to use. So ideally, they're going to be scented flowers, or something like dianthus or rose petals, lavender, lilac, violets even. Anything that you can get enough of in quantity that's actually really scented. So what you're basically doing with the jam is harnessing the scent to turn into a flavour. And you soak the petals in the lemon juice and cover them with sugar and leave them to macerate overnight before boiling everything up, adding more sugar and more lemon juice, and bringing it to boiling point so that it sets. It's not complicated. I'm not really a jam maker myself in terms of fruit, but even I can manage to make a floral jam without any difficulty.
Is there a particular flower that you would choose for that that's got just a really good flavour?
Well, I always end up seeming to use roses because I actually grow loads of roses. And so does my next door neighbour, so that I have them sort of readily available from about the beginning of June through to the end of the summer, through to the end of August. We've got lots of roses that grow on repeat. So they're my sort of go-to. I know not everybody likes the taste of rose, but it's amazing how different roses actually have different flavours. Some can be quite spicy. They're not all the kind of typical English rose taste or scent that you think of with perfumes or soaps. So actually I just quite like experimenting with lots of different roses and mixing them together to see what I end up with.
Yeah, and do they come out different colour depending on the petals?
They will do. I mean, to get the best colour for jams and jellies and syrups with roses, you really need to use dark. The darker the petal, the better the colour. If you use pale pink or white roses or yellow roses, you won't actually get an amazing colour, but you still get a good taste as long as the roses are heavily scented.
Yeah, I mean, I love the thought of mixing them together and seeing what you come up with. Yeah, brilliant. I love it. And also, I think you write about flowers in savoury recipes, which was a bit of a revelation. Can you just talk a bit about that?
Yes, so I had a go at using flowers in doughs and bread mixes. So, I mean, again, you probably wouldn't want to use a heavily scented flower, but the herb flowers work really well. Also in egg-based dishes, so scrambled eggs and omelettes. And then one of my key recipes in the spotlight section of the book is a calendula risotto. So, I mean, that's obviously a savoury dish where you're basically using calendula to replace saffron. So it colours the rice, a beautiful sort of dark orange colour. And then it's got this slightly, I say grassy, which then makes it sound a bit unpleasant, but it does have a natural flavour, not really strong. But if you just think, when you're eating a straightforward Milanese risotto, you can taste the saffron. It's the equivalent, but you're using calendula petals instead.
Yeah, I thought that looked delicious. I mean, again, something that I think I'd really like to try, haven't as yet, because we're not really in full flower season.
Well, we haven't quite got there yet, no, but we will do.
We will, I know. And I remind myself of that all the time when I look out the window and it's raining again. But thinking of that, is there a way, if you are really a lover of flowers in your cooking, is there a way we can still use them when it's not the main season?
Well, I've done a section on drying edible flowers so that you can use them. You can pick them and dry them just as you would dry flowers for making decorative bunches and keep them. You don't even really need to keep the stems. You can just chop off the dried heads and store them in tins and jars. And then their flavours probably won't be as strong. But for example, if you dry lavender and you want to use that later on in the year, you're definitely still going to get a real taste of lavender. The other things that you can do to preserve flowers are sort of traditional methods, like putting them in sugar, so you get a flavoured sugar. Obviously, making the syrups and jams is a way of preserving them as well. You can make vinegars, you can make alcoholic drinks, so you can put your favourite tasting flowers in gin or vodka. And that way you're going to have an edible flower concoction that will see you way past the end of the summer flowering period and take you through to the following year.
Yes, I love that. I was thinking, obviously, you've got the experience and you've done the research in terms of flavours and what goes with what. And we were talking about garnishes earlier, but are there any particularly interesting pairings where you've used a garnish on a food and thought, yes, that really, really works?
Well, I think in terms of garnishes, you're going to probably want things that really hold their shape. So, for example, antirrhinums, the snapdragons, they don't have a very strong flavour either, but they just look really intriguing and really interesting. What I quite like doing is skewing them onto a cocktail stick with a couple of olives and serving them with a martini. I mean, it's a way of using flowers so that you're going to surprise people slightly. And then, I mean, I suppose with a garnish, they may or may not decide to eat it. Other things that work really well, for example, a borage as a garnish on a cucumber dip. That's a really nice pairing. I think really it's a question of experimenting with what you've got in your garden. I mean, chive flowers are delicious with cheese. There's all sorts, really. I think you just have to kind of go with your own taste and see what you like.
Yeah, exactly. And it's an easy way of really impressing people, I think. And another way that you can really impress people, and I think also scare them a little bit, is to put flowers in your salads. Are there any that you'd recommend for that?
Well, the ones that you traditionally see in salad, as I said, are nasturtiums, and they do actually have a very distinctive peppery flavour. If you don't want people to sort of balk at the idea, I think using brightly coloured violas look really pretty in salads, and then the people might just pick them out, but that doesn't matter. They still look nice. Again, they don't have a very strong taste, but they do look really lovely against a plain green salad.
Yeah, and that's true because a lot of salad, can be very green. So these are just a fantastic way of making it look really special. And you mentioned syrups as well, and that's something that I have played around with, but I think I've probably, as you said, done the standard thing with the rose petals. Is there anything else that you'd recommend for a syrup?
I made a magnolia syrup this morning.
Oh, wow.
So magnolias are in season right now, and they're all edible. If you get your nose right into the flower, I mean, some have a slightly stronger scent than others, but they all have that sort of undertone of a citrusy note. And when you make a syrup with them, that's what you're left with. So you can use that. You could probably use it in savoury dishes as well as sweet, but I think it's actually really nice to use it in cakes or drizzled over desserts.
Yeah, lovely. And the other thing that I have been playing around with a bit, and again, I've been very standard and I've used rose petals and violets because they're in season at the moment, but teas as well. Is there anything you recommend for teas?
Well, if you grow Monarda, which is the bee balm flower, and it has that delicious Earl Grey scent to it, that's a fantastic one for flavouring. You make your own Earl Grey tea, basically, by layering the petals between black tea leaves. You can make your own chamomile tea, obviously, just using chamomile flowers. I think you can probably almost use any kind of flower to make your own tea, depending on your own taste, or mix different flowers together to make, if you want to make a rose tea, but you could actually include something else as well. Just experiment again. I mean, as soon as you pour hot water over any flower, it just releases the scent and the flavour. So it's just worth experimenting with what you've got growing in your own garden.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, all of these things really make such nice presents as well, I think. So they're just kind of win-win really all round. And thinking about more of a practical level, I'm sure this varies from flower to flower, but sometimes, like you mentioned, the viola flowers, and I think, oh, should I be pulling the petals off or can I leave them whole? And how much of the base of the flower can I include? Is it very much flower specific?
I think it's pretty much flower specific. I wouldn't always recommend eating the base of flower. I think with violas, primroses, any of the flowers that are out now, just little spring flowers, you can more or less eat the whole thing. But for example, tulips are edible, but I would always just take the petals off and scatter those over a pavlova or a dessert or something. And, with the dahlias, you'd be hard pushed to get a whole dahlia in your mouth. Again, I would always take the petals off and scatter them over. I mean, I do give some instruction in my book about which parts of the flower are edible and which aren't, but you probably just need to use your common sense. So a small flower that is always probably going to be fine, but anything with a particularly large head or with protruding stamens, you want to remove the stamens.
Yeah, makes sense. And also thinking of that, I don't know why I've singled this out, but honeysuckle, am I right in thinking you can eat those?
Yes. I mean, that's a good one for making syrups with because of the scent. Anything like that where you want to harness the scent. So basically when you make a syrup, you're extracting the scent and then you discard the actual flower head. So you're not actually going to eat the flower.
So if anyone was a little bit scared of eating flowers, what would you like them to take away from listening to this?
Well, I think if you're scared of the idea of putting an actual flower in your mouth or adding it to a dish as a whole flower, then have a go with making some jams or some syrups or some cordials and play around with extracting the scent. And it's a bit like making your own perfume, but you're going to use it sparingly to make some fairy cakes, for example, or flavour your icing, or make a homemade granita. Or I do one where I melt dark chocolate and I stir rose syrup into it to make my own little rose chocolate truffles, which are absolutely delicious as a special gift for somebody or an after dinner treat. I think there's lots of things that you can do which add a little bit of something special to your cookery skills, but don't really involve sitting down and eating a plate full of flowers.
Thank you very much to Carolyn for taking the time to speak to me. And thank you for listening. If you like this interview, I recommend checking out episode 31 with Jan Billington, all about edible flowers, which was released on the 10th of September 2019. And also episode 181, Welcome to Mintopia, with Dr. Cy Paul, which was released on the 14th of March 2022. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.